Hello and welcome to this summary of some of the interesting, cool and dumb things from 2020 that are worth taking another look at. After all, everyone can now claim to have had 2020 hindsight. Perhaps the most impressive items across the board have been those around the CCP virus, primarily beginning with the incredible effort to bring not one but 3 currently approved vaccines to market. Bringing one vaccine to market in a year for something like the CCP virus is impressive. Having brought 3 with different mechanisms and designs from different companies is a huge endeavor. Understand, it sometimes took decades to develop a vaccine for a disease. The influenza vaccines took a long time to develop, and the only reason we can keep using them is because of how they were designed and how that design has been flexible enough to let people continue to modify it for every season. What has taken years, if not decades in other cases, was done in under 6 months. That is, we had a vaccine that could treat what is currently one of the leading diseases in the world in under 6 months, and it's being deployed now. This, of course, did not just happen. It needed a massive injection of money, time, resources, and knowledge. That is the reason why the emergency authorization went through as quickly and effectively as it did. When you look at the brilliance of the researchers, scientists, and more involved in that, the next item should help to temper your euphemism. At the time that the otherwise unnamed CCP virus was spreading, it was closely associated in name with Corona beer. This meant more than 40% of Americans would not drink Corona beer due to what at the time was simply a coronavirus. That is how sad the state of education and science literacy is in America. 4 out of every 10 Americans would not drink a brand of beer because it had a similar name to the virus. Of course, that's not the only thing to help you temper your euphemism. There was a massive increase across 2020 with people calling Poison's hotline in order to find out whether or not they had been poisoned by bleach. This wasn't just a random occurrence though. These calls, and the reason behind them, was directly related to people trying to disinfect themselves, their homes, and other places with bleach, but not following the proper care precautions when using it. Somewhat ironically, these care precautions are not so different to what would be required to try and keep yourself safe from the CCP virus. And in most cases, this same information is found on the very packaging that you're using. Despite this, there was a drastic increase across 2020 of people calling because they had either thought themselves poisoned or had poisoned themselves with bleach. In a tangent to poisoning, we had the unfortunate fiasco of hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine was sort of like an addict chasing their next high. People kept trying to find a new way to use it, moving the goalposts, and so many different variables in how they were designing research around it as a clinical treatment for the CCP virus that no one could ever get consistent results or demonstrate efficacy in clinical practice. In the last year, more than 9,600 articles were published on that one drug alone, and a significant portion of these were all tied into the CCP virus. That tells you how much interest one drug generated, but that one drug produced 0 leads in the end. That is a lot of wasted time and effort, despite repeated, clear, and concise indications that it was not a path that would lead anywhere. In other disappointing news, there's a general disappointment in humanity, not in researchers. You have to ask yourself, what kind of person is going to first go into a supermarket or grocery store and buy every roll of toilet paper? Then you need to ask yourself, who was going to take those rolls of toilet paper and sell them at an exorbitant markup, effectively scalping. Unfortunately, it turns out a lot of people. Research shows that there are a variety of factors from a personality and psychological point of view that would predispose you to doing this. The problem is that many people did it that you begin to wonder, is this simply a fault in humans, or is it simply that there are a lot of people who did not think very well about what they were doing? The situation led to scenes like this, where you have people literally fighting in the aisles of a supermarket over a single package of toilet paper. While that video comes from Australia, Australia also experienced a rather interesting phenomena with some of their native flora and fauna, specifically some of the most dangerous spider species. Due to the unusually hot weather, which led to some of the most devastating bushfires for Australia in a very long time, the following rain caused the spider population to boom quite suddenly. This sudden increase in the number of spiders, due to hot weather and then rain, led to an increase in the number of funnel web spiders and others that are quite dangerous. Although not having killed anyone in many, many years, they are still very painful and unpleasant. And this was yet another sign in Australia that 2020 may well have been the year of an apocalypse. Fire, flood, dangerous insects, and disease. In other animal news, we did get the rather funny information that penguins in Antarctica produce so much feces that it actually turns into laughing gas. For those of you who aren't aware, laughing gas is a surprisingly simple chemical formula. This formula is otherwise known as nitrous oxide. It's two nitrogens and an oxygen molecule. Together these cause the euphoria we know from laughing gas. The phenomena is interesting just because of how unexpected it is. Less unexpected is the next piece of news in that a company has finally brought a meat product to market that is entirely laboratory grown. This in part was to satisfy environmental consciousness. The idea they have is to sell a laboratory meat product. Currently it is relatively expensive, at several $100s per kilogram. The idea is to eventually bring it down to a premium cost, but still closer to what normal, conventionally grown chicken meat would cost. This was done by a Singapore-based company where it was also approved. Going from Asia across to Africa, there's been a long-running effort to try and develop potato species that are resistant to many different diseases. The big one being potato blight, the cause of the Irish famine, and in fact, mass starvation across most of Europe at the time. It's taken quite a while, and even now the solution's not perfect. What has happened is the researchers found a wild plant in Africa that had a gene that made it somewhat resistant to that blight pathogen. Researchers could take advantage of it, fortify it, and put it into potatoes. Potatoes in Africa make up a very large portion of most staple crops and food. This means the loss of it at the agricultural level significantly impacts the food security of Africa. In similar genetic news, although not quite the same, 23andMe was able to produce their first pharmaceutical product based on their genomic data. For those of you who aren't aware, 23andMe is a genetic testing company that the average person can access. You order a test kit, receive it, take your sample, send it back to them, and they provide you with a results sheet. This sheet isn't necessarily the most useful of information, but it can often be helpful in trying to figure out some factors: heritage, relationships, and very basic, cursory level investigative things. The amount of information that 23andMe can extract from this is much more. They can do this for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the most important is They have everyone's data, not just yours. This means they can explore the data at a macro level well beyond the average person, and in fact, often verging on comparable to some governments. This is why 23andMe were able to explore what is in their library of data and find commonalities to not only medical conditions but to gene mutations. From this, they are then able to go through and figure out if there are any drugs that are either currently made or prospectively could be made to work for particular conditions. While on the topic of genomes and genetics in general, we should talk about the interesting case study of the divergence of penicillin mold. There are two main strains of penicillin. There is a variety made in America and there is a variety made in Europe. The American version deviated significantly from the European version not long after it was established. This meant you had two different arms of evolution, adaptation, mutation, and development. Given how much time has passed between them, it's interesting to look at just what has changed and whether or not it's influencing the penicillin that is being produced. If nothing else, it's worth exploring to find out how the mold varieties have changed between the two and whether or not that difference would alter their ability to be used on a commercial scale. Going back to things that would help to deteriorate your belief in humanity, we should look at the man who managed to nearly kill himself in attempting to remove a piece of popcorn and cleaning his own teeth. And that's right, in trying to remove popcorn from his teeth, a 41-year-old man nearly killed himself this year, and is just one example of many cases where people try to do things themselves that they were well and truly not prepared for. In order to remove the popcorn, the man attempted a number of things. Toothpicks, which seemed reasonable enough. Then he went to a pen lid, then a piece of wire, and then a nail. Yeah, it's no surprise that he developed a heart infection shortly thereafter that damaged his heart valves. Going from the bizarrely stupid to the understandable but futile. Anti-vaxxers also began lawsuits against Facebook this year. In short, they were claiming that Facebook was censoring them when it came to a variety of subjects. This was the result of a new policy Facebook brought out. Big tech in general has decided to censor things they consider fringe conspiracy theories. Science denialism, Holocaust denialism, anti-vaxxers, so on. Naturally, these groups are not happy, and unfortunately, many of these groups are much better connected and prepared to push back, or at least they're far more committed to the cause than others are. This has led to lawsuits, not just lawsuits on an individual basis, but often class actions. When we look at that, it should be no surprise that given how much power big tech yields, they are now being increasingly examined very closely by the United States government, particularly when it comes to Section 230 of the DMCA. This is the section of law that allows online services like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and so on to act as a platform, not a publisher. The distinction's important for a number of reasons, but the primary one is legal. If a company, or in this case service like YouTube, was considered a publisher, they would be liable for anything that would be considered slanderous or libel. In the early days of the internet, this was considered a big enough threat that online giants lobbied the government to give them protections to ensure that their users could not cripple their companies. Section 230 came into being where it said, if you are running something like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and more, that you cannot be selective in what you let on your platform, because that is what an editor does as part of a publishing company. The US government is now looking at what these online tech giants are doing and is asking themselves very carefully, is their action the equivalent of a publisher or a platform? And if it's found that these services are in fact a publisher and not a platform, it's going to open a very large and very messy can of worms, not just for these services, but for the users of the platforms as such. Going from a messy online technology-based focus, we can look now at some of the legal mess associated with 2020 and even the years before. This is largely the talcum powder lawsuits that Johnson & Johnson has faced. In short, it has been claimed, and in some court cases won, that Johnson & Johnson's talcum powder products contained a problematic compound of some sort that led to the talcum becoming embedded in the ovaries, leading to ovarian cancer. If we go back 50 or even 70 years, there'd be a lot more validity to this claim. That's because at that time, talcum powder contained asbestos, and asbestos is a very nasty carcinogen. Coming to the present, and even quite a few years back, that's not the case, and this is where a meta-analysis of the data comes in. The problem was that meta-analyses could find no association between cancer and talcum powder use. The reason this is a problem? Those lawsuits were relying on medical opinion but not large data. The fundamental position was that these people had developed cancer and talcum powder was responsible. The courts ultimately desided with the plaintiffs, which left Johnson & Johnson in a precarious position where they can appeal, but they may not be able to introduce the science. Rather, they have to find a legal basis for it. This is one reason why courts should decide law, not science. Going back to things that will hopefully reinvigorate your hope in the world, tobacco plants have been successfully used to produce an influenza vaccine in 2020. What is even better is that these products were as effective as conventionally manufactured influenza vaccines. The normal procedure, or at least until relatively recently, has been to introduce the influenza virus into eggs, primarily chicken eggs. Here it would multiply and become the influenza virus. It would be extracted, refined, and processed to be turned into the influenza vaccine. Naturally, such a large-scale process requires a lot of time, effort, resources, and waste in the form of animals, or would-be animals. Developing it in a plant like this has a number of upsides. This includes the fact that you can continue to use the same plant for a very extended period. You get good yields, and at least in theory, you can begin producing your vaccine in a far quicker turnaround time than you can with the chicken egg approach. While on the topic of treatments and similar, the FDA also approved a peanut allergy treatment. This would be a very big thing if it succeeds. Peanut allergies, especially amongst children, are very dangerous and increasingly common. The ability to treat and intervene early on in the childhood development means that the risk for children is significantly lower, that they'll live longer, happier lives, and will not suddenly find themselves either needing an EpiPen or going to the hospital. Japan has also been beginning its own interesting experiments, but theirs are related to heart failure. These were very early trials of the transplantation of heart cells into heart failure patients in order to help them recover heart function. In very broad strokes, the heart failure patient has cells that are damaged, often through a cardiac arrest or infarction. You might know this as a heart attack. This means those cells are permanently dead and replaced with scar tissue. That part of the heart will no longer function. They will not be replaced by new cells, as would be the case if you had cut your skin. This is one of the downsides to the cells in the heart. The Japanese researchers have tried introducing new cells that will both fill the gap where the scar tissue is or would develop, and also replicate enough to be able to provide a large number of cells that will help to reinvigorate the heart. Obviously, there are concerns with such a novel approach, primarily the possible risk of those cells becoming carcinogenic, and cancer of the heart is very, very rare, if not unheard of, but it is possible with this novel approach. While we're on the topic of novelty, we should talk about the flat earthers. And yes, there are people who believe the earth is flat. No doubt they're the same people who were commenting very early in this video that Australia is not real and therefore the spiders weren't an issue. What we want to talk about in this video particularly is the flat earther known as Mike Hughes, or Mad Mike. He was the brilliant mind behind building his own rocket to go as high up into the sky as possible and be able to see the edge of the world. Whether that's a disc or square is up to you, but we favour the square Earth model. Of course, as you can imagine, a home-built rocket is not exactly the most suitable, stable, or quality-assured product. As a result, the rocket crashed. Unfortunately, this led to the death of Mad Mike. It's only unfortunate insofar as if he had kept living, we might have had more interesting stories. His shenanigans were, or at least will be, missed. While on the topic of denialism, things that would disappoint you, and the unbelievable, we cannot round up 2020 without touching on the Marie Claire news articles that suggested women put parsley in their vagina. Yes, Marie Claire, well known for its gossip columns, terrible health-related news, and contradictory information, at least managed to get their story straight in one regard. They want you to put parsley in your vagina. They obviously realized that this was a terrible idea, as the article was, shortly after it was published, removed from any of their digital platforms. As you can imagine, this particular piece of health advice was not welcomed by anyone with any medical knowledge, or in fact any modest knowledge of what is and is not healthy. Beyond the obvious fact that introducing a foreign object into your personal parts without good reason, and certainly without sanitizing it, is a bad idea, including organic matter in that process is a much worse idea. This is probably why Marie Claire removed it, and quite possibly pending litigation when someone actually followed the article's instructions and developed a none too pleasant infection. Other disappointing news regards Netflix, and apart from their inclusion of child exploitation material in 2020, they also began to host Gwyneth Paltrow's GOOP. They ran a 6-part mini-series which provided all manner of helpful health advice based on Gwyneth Paltrow's GOOP website. This is the same website that sold a 24-carat gold dildo, jade eggs to put into your vagina, and NASA-endorsed stickers that were not NASA-endorsed. Netflix certainly had a very unpleasant 2020 as a result of these various debacles, but their inclusion of Gwyneth Paltrow's pseudoscience is simply icing on the cake, and perhaps the epitome of Netflix failures to do quality control in their rush to increase content for their online platform. Among the issues that GOOP has is that it is very much scam-like, and as a result, many of the things claimed both on the website and the Netflix series lack evidence to support them. What doesn't lack evidence to support it is our last interesting and confusing item. A woman had breast implants put in her, and for most people, these are not life-saving products. In fact, more often than not, they are purely cosmetic upgrades of a sort. In this instance, though, a woman stopped a .4 caliber bullet with her breast implant, which is not something many people can say, that they physically stopped a bullet with their own body. What is even more bizarre is that this gun-related violence occurred in Canada of all places. If not for this, it's quite possible the breast implant would have done nothing, and instead the bullet would have gone straight through her heart. Thank goodness for Canada's polite bullets. That's a roundup of 2020's most interesting news items, so to speak. The good, the bad, the dumb, and the funny. Although there was plenty else covered in 2020, these are just some of the highlights. And, as with 2020, we will continue to try and summarize this each week in our This Week's What Were They Thinking? Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you might have below.